to take care of her. And just it's that time of year. Everybody's on the road. And on that note, Rob and Linda will be traveling this weekend, not only to go home for the holidays, but Linda's mom fell and broke her hip on Monday and then passed away on Tuesday. So they've got a funeral in the holidays. So they'll be heading out Saturday for that. And so just remember them over the next couple of weeks as they gather for the funeral. We are in Romans chapter 1 tonight, talking about the idea of a world view. We've been, and I realize we're kind of coming back from like a 2 or 3 week break between Thanksgiving and the power outage. So this is like the first week. We started the class about a month ago, had 2 weeks off, and maybe forgot some things. But we're kind of looking at the idea of truth over trend, the idea that trying to find truth and understand truth in a world that really everything's kind of changing on us. Like, things that were set in stone, if I can use that phrase, 20, 30, 40 years ago are no longer set in stone. Things that were repulsive 20, 30, 40 years ago are now accepted. Things that I can remember even in my lifetime watching a TV show I grew up watching, Diagnosis Murder. Does anybody here remember that TV show, like 90s? There's a scene in that TV show where Dick Van Dyke's son, I forgot the character's name, is being asked to go on a date or to sleep with a married woman, and the character says, "No, I can't do that. That's adultery." Like, the idea of hearing that on a TV show today, you wouldn't. 20 or 30 years ago, you would. So much in our society has changed, and so with that in mind, we're always kind of looking for something to kind of hold on to, something to cling to. And so today I want us to consider the idea of a worldview. So what is a worldview? When you hear that word, worldview, that's a tongue twister, what comes to your mind? Have you heard that? Go ahead.
The construct in which you form all of your faith, your beliefs, your actions, etc.
And he comes in with a great dictionary definition, the construct by which you form all of your actions. And that's a great definition. Really, that's a really, really good definition. Yeah, so it's a construct, the way you kind of formulate and process things. I have it a little more simpler because that's a really good definition. But I have it as the worldview is our view, or comprehending and understanding and looking at the world around us. That our worldview is our way of trying to answer those fundamental questions about life. Like, how did we get here? Why are we here? Like, those very basic questions. The worldview is what we build our lives around. I think about Matthew chapter 7. Toward the end of Matthew 7, there's this statement at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Wise man builds his house upon the rock. The rains come and the floods rage, and the house stands firm. The other person, the foolish man, doesn't. The wise man had what we would call today a biblical worldview. He sought to obey God's commands, and the foolish man did not. The worldview is what we build our lives around. And so some people today have worldviews that are incoherent, a smorgasbord of options, mix a lot of different ideas together, pre-modern and postmodern. You know what postmodern means? It's basically the idea that there is no absolute truth. That's a very Cliff Notes definition. And then there's the Christian worldview. And a consistent, this is key, a consistent Christian worldview provides clarity, meaning, and purpose in all aspects of life. but the struggle for us today, at least my struggle, is connecting what we hear on Sunday or read in God's Word to how we live consistently. But what we need to realize is that our worldview has consequences. How we approach the world, how we see the world has consequences for our day-to-day life. And we see that play out there in Romans chapter 1. In Romans chapter 1, Paul, this is going to shock you, is writing to the church there in Rome. And the church there in Rome had a lot of things happen to it over the previous 10 years before the book was written. Claudius, the emperor, had issued a decree that got all of the Jews out of Rome. And now, some years later, about 5 to 7 years later, Nero has allowed them back into Rome, allowed the Jews back into Rome. And so the Roman church was a primarily Gentile church for about 5 to 7 years. For a period of time, it was Jew and Gentile. Now, the Gentiles basically, if I can put it this way, ruled the roost. It was a Gentile church. And now the Jews have moved back into town, and there's this struggle, there's this conflict between the Jews and the Gentiles, and there's a little bit of disharmony between the two groups in the book of Romans. And so Paul writes this book to a group of Christians, most of whom he doesn't know too well. And there in Romans chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, he says some words that if we're Bible students, if we've been going to Bible class our entire life, maybe we memorized it when we were kids. He says in verse 16, I am not ashamed of the gospel because of the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and also to the Greek. If you remember from English class, thesis statement. This is Paul's thesis statement for the book of Romans. And then there in verse 17, he says, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. That's his thesis statement. The rest of the book of Romans kind of looks back to those two verses, connects back. And so what Paul's going to do for the first couple of chapters, Romans 1, 2, and 3, is really explain that we are all sinners, that we've all rejected God, and we all need a Savior to save us from God's wrath. And then he starts in verse 18 by describing the Gentile worldview, the pagan worldview, what we would say today may be the secular worldview. How would you describe that secular worldview there in verses 18 through 32? How would you describe that Gentile, that secular, that pagan worldview there in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32? Summarize it. Yeah.
I've got a heading that I think summarizes it nicely, which is unbelief and its consequences.
Yeah, unbelief. A lot of times, those headings in our Bibles, they're really helpful. And a lot of times they do a great job of summarizing. They're not inspired, but that's a great one. Unbelief and its consequences. The Gentiles, the pagans, the secular worldview did not believe in God, and with that came consequences. And so what we're going to see there in the text is the consequences of rejecting truth, of rejecting that Christian worldview. And what we see there, maybe it's a little close to home to us as Americans, because we see some elements of our society in those verses. Maybe we see a little bit of our past life there in those verses. And what we see there as Paul unpacks his point over the next couple of chapters is without truth, anything goes. Without truth, there's no right and wrong. Without truth, no one can judge anyone. But there is a standard of truth. We talked about this, I think, a couple of weeks ago. Robert Jackson, who was one of the U.S. officials at the Nuremberg trials, that's after World War II. They're trying the Nazis for their war crimes, for those who aren't familiar with the Nuremberg trials. He was also, I think, an associate justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. During the Nuremberg trials on July 26, 1946, appeal to a law that rises above the provincial and the transient. I want to put that in terms that aren't said by a Supreme Court justice and someone with that kind of mind. There is a law that transcends both time and place. That a law that goes beyond the time and history in which we live and the borders of the country that we live as well. And his point there was what the Nazis did may have been legal in Germany at that point in time. But it was wrong because it goes against a moral law. There are certain things he understood that are objectively wrong in every situation. But there is a seismic shift in our society. That 58% of Americans believe that moral truth is relative. Evangelicals, and so that's defined here in this survey, as Bible-believing, or people who believe the Bible to be true and the reliable Word of God, are just as likely, according to this survey, to reject absolute moral truth as to accept its existence. And only a minority of born-again Christians, 43%, still embrace absolute truth. When you see those numbers, what goes through your head? Yeah.
I just think that we don't all mean the same thing when we say I don't believe it.
Yeah. For me, I read that and I go, you believe the Bible as a reliable Word of God, but you reject moral truth? Like, one of these things is not like the other. Like, what gives? What else do you notice? What else jumps out to you about that? Maybe some consequences in the religious world today. We look out in other religious bodies, perhaps, and how maybe they're compromising a little bit on things that we see are clearly in Scripture, and we'll discuss LGBTQIA plus issues, and how they have accepted those or have explained away the traditional biblical doctrine on marriage. There has been a seismic shift in our society, and it is influencing Christians in general in the watershed. Yeah.
As I was thinking about this today, I kept on thinking that, and I would agree that there's a seismic shift in this country from, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And at the same time, look at longer history. These issues have been there. It's one of those where God has rendered judgment.
Mm-hmm.
People come back. God
Yeah.
So it's not like it's anything new. It's part of, we are witnessing the difference between good and evil.
Yeah.
And it goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, you mentioned that, and I've been working on a sermon from Ecclesiastes about the purpose of life, and that life has a purpose, and trying to find our purpose in life. And so I've been in Ecclesiastes all this week. I don't know if I'm going to preach it this Sunday because Daryl is telling me that he thinks he's going to be good to go. So Daryl may be preaching on Sunday. Daryl may not be preaching because of his back. But I'm still kind of working on it. And there's a part of Ecclesiastes where the writer Solomon is basically saying, in English terms today, there is nothing new under the sun. What is, has been. What the struggles, as Rob pointing out, that we're seeing in our society today, guess what? The Greeks and the Romans dealt with it too. He's going to go on there in the text to explicitly deal with the sexual sin there in the text. And we'll unpack it then, but just to kind of, I don't want to say tease, but as a hint of what's to come, sexual sin, sexual degradation was really common in the Greco-Roman world. And we look at our world today, 2,000 years later, and we still face those same problems, those same struggles today. But I want to point out this, that it is not just a out there problem, an out there struggle. Some of the things that we see out there and we see in here. In the wider Christian world, how many times do we see reports of sexual abuse and sexual sin among Christian leaders? How many times do those sins maybe affect people we know and love? The struggles that we see in the world so often end up affecting us. They influence us. The fact that the world, the unbelievers out there, the secular and the pagan worldview has rejected God and rejected absolute truth, that influence has seeped into the church, as we just saw with some statistics. And so let's just look at the text there in Romans chapter 1 and verse 18. As Paul describes this worldview, the guilt is my heading, but the unbelief and its consequences is what Rob has. Paul says this in verse 18, "For God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all godlessness and unrighteousness of people who, by their unrighteousness, suppress the truth. Since what is known or can be known about God is evident among them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, that is his eternal power, his divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made. As a result, people are without excuse." What is Paul saying there in Romans chapter 1? What's he saying in those first 3 verses? Put it in terms you can understand. Yeah.
I think the first verse is the primary thing you have to do is suppress truth.
Yeah.
That's where you have to start.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're going to accept some of the sins we're going to see described here later in the chapter, you start by suppressing truth, by denying truth. What else do you guys see there? Particularly, I think, in verse 19 and 20. Yeah,
I'll be Chris, I'll keep talking.
there you go.
So you have to suppress truth, and then you have to decide that there is no God.
Yeah,
Because one leads to the other, right?
Yeah.
The only way you get to reach that conclusion is to start by, I don't think there's a truth, and because that means there can't be a God either.
Yeah. They're denying the existence of a creator, and without a creator, there is no standard to decide what is right and wrong, what is true and what is false, what is true and what is error. They look out, and even though God has revealed himself through creation, that we can look at the world around us in the precise design of the world and go, there has to be somebody behind it. Like, no one would pick up their phone, their iPhone, designed by Apple in California, and say, this just happened by accident. And yet the universe is infinitely more complex than our iPhones. And yet that's exactly what we do when we deny a creator. We look at the design in the universe and say, well, there must not be a creator out there. His fingerprints are everywhere. But people have closed their eyes to God. You have something you want to say.
Well, we hear artificial intelligence.
Yes.
What do you think that is?
So,
That's a loaded question.
yeah.
So it is artificial. It's not real. It's not the truth. But this is what they're doing to us and making us confused. So it makes us question. And we get lost
Yeah.
in that.
Yeah. So, without getting into a side thing on AI or artificial intelligence, to summarize, it's basically computers spitting out information based on information that's already there. So, like, I'm not encouraging any of the students in here to do it, okay? But theoretically, you can go on there and say, go to Gemini or ChatGPT, don't do this, and type, write me a 5-page paper on liberty in slavery in antebellum South. And it's going to spit out a 5-page paper. You can say, write me a 5-page paper on that topic with 20 citations from professional applicants, and it's going to do that. You can go on there. Not that I would encourage anybody to do that, but play with me. And write me a 2,000-word sermon outline. You can do this with 3 points from this text. And it's going to go on the internet and look at all the information out there and intelligently gather it all together and spit it back out to you using all the power of computing. And so, but you're right, it's not human, it's computers.
And that's what our kids are into all day long.
Oh, not just the kids.
Yeah.
Artificial intelligence, I'm going to be honest, it can be really helpful. There are some things you can use artificial intelligence to help you with to make your life easier. Some of the younger kids, including myself, I'm not a kid anymore, I got a kid, but we use AI to do some things around the house, to do some things relating to our job perhaps, that makes our life easier. Perhaps we say, write me a lesson plan on this with this objective. I don't know how teachers, but it's possible to use it in a beneficial way. AI does complicate things in our life. There's some issues that our society is still trying to sort through when it comes to AI. Yeah.
Shift the gears
Yeah.
here a little bit with regard to, creation being that evidence. A lot of the scientists will look to Einstein as,
Yeah.
a genius, and
Yeah.
if you read any of his writings, he believed in a creator.
Yeah.
Somebody had to design this universe. It didn't just happen by chance. And his mathematical mind, he was always trying to find that mathematical
Yeah.
equation to resolve that. But I don't know that he ever was a faith or believer in Christ Jesus. But at the same time, he never denied that there wasn't a superior being that created the universe.
Yeah, you see that, and that's the struggle in a lot of scientists and a lot of people out there, that they look at the world, they acknowledge there is organization, there is design, there has to be design, but their worldview and their view of God is somewhere between like the Force from Star Wars to a deistic type of like God got the world started, but he put his hands off, almost like a Thomas Jefferson deistic worldview. Jefferson believed in a God, but if you looked at his Bible, as I understand it, he cut out all the references to miracles. He didn't believe God intervened in the world today. And so here in the text in verse 20, even though people look out and see the design of the universe and it's declaring the glory of God, it says in verse 21, for though they knew God, for they recognized God existed, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became worthless. Their senseless hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of an immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. They exchanged the glory of a created God, or creator God, for the created. And that had consequences. When you exchange the glory of a true creator God for an idol, that affects how you live. So let's think for a moment. What in the world is an idol? How would you define the world an idol? Yeah.
Verse 23.
Verse 23, okay.
That's the definition.
Yeah.
Right there.
So the glory of an immortal God for images. So you create an idol is when you go and you bow down to a golden staff. Or golden calf, excuse me.
again, that idol is something that man can see and touch.
Yeah.
Where God is, you know, he speaks to us through his word and through
Yeah.
the world around us. But that's where I think, again, man got off track. They wanted to have something that they could actually touch
Yeah.
and see.
See and touch. They wanted the golden calf. They wanted
We
the
had that
statue.
in the garden.
Yeah.
We,
Yeah.
we lost
We
that
lost
when
it.
we were kicked out of the garden.
Yeah. We didn't appreciate it in the garden, so we were kicked out. And once we got kicked out, it's one of those things, oops, we kind of wish being able to see and walk and talk with our God. Yeah.
Well, if you go back to artificial intelligence, it's artificial. Artificial isn't real. It's a copycat.
Yeah.
So that's what you're saying now. It's a
Yeah.
copycat. You don't want God, but you want what he's got.
Yes.
So you
Yes.
copy it
Yeah.
with something you can sit up there and look at,
Yeah.
and you, next thing you know, that's the idol.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, but can I shift or maybe expand? Because I think you guys are right in the idea that an idol is a statue, something that you've exchanged the glory of the god for the calf or the statue of Athena. Back in Nashville, where I was born and grew up just outside Nashville, they have a full-scale replica of the Parthenon and from Athens. Like, the statue is the same inside of Athena. Like, it's exactly 1-to-1 scale. Really cool to go see. And if you're my sister, you get lucky and you run into a country music star while you're there. But an idol is more than a statue that they worshipped in the Greco-Roman world. It's more than a statue that Israel worshipped at Sinai. I want us to expand beyond that and bring it close to home. Yeah.
It's talking about the key word of glory, exchanging the glory. So the glory isn't like, alone is not like a physical appearance. I mean, it can include a physical appearance, but the glory is the very character and essence and
Yeah.
living attributes of a person.
Yeah, so what do you glorify? And I think is what you're saying. Like, where do you put... And the way I've heard people describe it, and I love this definition. I've seen it a couple of times in books and sermons and ideas. Whatever your heart clings to for ultimate security. Where does your heart go? What does your heart really glorify? And when we think about idol that way, yes, it can be a cow. Yes, it can be a stick. In fact, there's a time in Israel's history where they worshiped that bronze serpent that Moses had raised up there in the wilderness when they got bit by snakes, if you remember that story. They were bowing down to a golden serpent. There are times in Greco-Roman history where they bowed down to Athena and to Zeus and to Mars and all the Greco-Roman, gods that we learned in school. But a god, an idol, is anything our heart clings to for ultimate security. And when we think about idols that way, when we think about gods that way, I think it hits close to home for us. Because that means our idol can be our family. It can be our job. It can be school. It can be work. It can be a bank account. It can be our retirement account. It can be anything. Because we put our trust and our faith and we glorify that. And there are serious consequences for replacing or exchanging the glory of a creator God with something that is created. And that's what Paul describes there starting in verse 24. The consequences. That because they started worshiping the created, God therefore delivered them over in the desires of their heart to sexual impurity, so that their bodies were degraded among themselves. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served what has been created instead of the Creator, who is praised forever. Amen. Yeah, we like to think when we read the Bible, and in the context of what Paul is saying here to the text, in Romans chapter 1, he's turning and primarily addressing the Gentiles here. He's looking at the Gentile Christians there in Rome and saying, look, guys, You're sinners. You worship these idols. That's in your past. But idolatry, as we've been talking, is not just a Gentile problem. The Jews struggled with it too. We all, even 2,000 years later, after Paul wrote this, sometimes have a temptation, maybe more than sometimes, to worship something other than the Creator God, to have that idol in our life, something that sits on the throne of our hearts. Maybe ourself, maybe nature, maybe the money and the power and the politics. In fact, I would go so far as to argue, and I think Paul is doing the same thing here, that the root of all sin is exchanging something for God in our hearts. Anything for the Creator. And so there in the first century, when he's writing to the Greeks there, the Gentile Christians, he's like, look, you came out of this. You worship the created world. And as a result, what did you do? What was your life beforehand? He tells them there in Romans 1. You became exactly like what you worshiped. That gods in the Greco-Roman world were just like humans, or the humans were just like gods. They created gods in their image. That Zeus and Apollo and Mars and Venus and Athena and all those gods that we learned about in school, well, they had the same temptations and the same problems and the same struggles that humans do. Idolatry always leads to immorality. And so God gave them over there in the text. He gave them over, verse 26, to disgraceful passions. Their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. The men in the same way also left natural relations with women and were inflamed in their lust for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the appropriate penalty of their error. Let's ask a question here. Why is Paul using sexual sin as an example here? He's used it there in verse 24. He's used it again in verse 26 and 27. Why? Is the focus of Paul's condemnation, if I can say it that way, of the Gentile way of life, focused and built around sexual sin.
Those things were happening in the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
I mean, those were
All of
evident
Yeah.
publicly.
So, the Greco-Roman world, particularly the Greeks, sexual sin was part of life. For a variety of reasons, based on some things I read. Again, I'm a little bit of a history geek, so we're going to dig into that just for a second. The Greeks in that day didn't really value female life. That if you had a daughter, I'm going to paraphrase here, it was 50-50 if you let her live. A daughter doesn't make a great soldier in the Greco-Roman world. You wanted sons. And so there was a shortage of women in the Greco-Roman world. Second to that, because there was a shortage, men usually were, let's say, 30 years old when they got married, and they were marrying 14-year-old girls. You got married a little older. And so you have 30 years trying to figure out how to deal with those temptations and those urges. And so part of the Greco-Roman way of life was it was not uncommon for Greek men to take a young boy as a boyfriend, as a, for lack of a better term, a mistress. Except not a mistress, but you get the idea. And to have sexual relationship. That was common. That was accepted. Roman philosophers kind of looked down on it, but in parts of Roman society, and really all of Roman society, homosexuality was seen throughout Roman society. Roman emperors were known to have boyfriends. Nero, the emperor, when Paul writes Romans, had boyfriends. Had, I think, multiple boyfriends. It was just part of life. It was accepted. So it was, the Greco-Roman world was filled with examples of sexual sin. You could go to the temple and as an act of worship to whatever god, commit sexual immorality. That was the world they lived in. That's the world these Roman Christians came out of. That's the world these Roman Christians are trying to make sense of. We're not alone. Any other reasons why Paul uses sexual sin as an example here? Yeah.
There's the relationship aspect where it's not just this physical thing, like, well, they're talking about how they exchange higher things for lower, which like the animals, etc. But it's also, there's a relationship, like, there's a spiritual type antitype for God and man.
If I understand where you're going with, I think you're spot on. That same-sex sin and sexual sin represents a rejection of God. Cole, you had your...
Mine's going to be a little bit.
Go ahead.
No, you go first.
No, it's like same-sex sin or sexual sin rejects God. It rejects God's design. That God has designed the sexual relationship for a specific point and a specific purpose. One man, one woman for life. And sexual relations in the context of that. And so anything other than that design is a rejection of God. And especially Paul's point there in verses 26 and 27, the same-sex sin is completely and totally rejecting God's design. That natural design, that natural desire that we all have for the opposite gender is rejected. And so God turns him over to disgraceful passions. And for Paul, what Paul is saying here on a very basic level is same-sex sin. Sexual sin represents a world gone wrong. Cole.
Mine's definitely a little bit more like, I don't know, it's a reach.
Yeah.
And it kind of connects to 28 through 31, so I want to know, are you going to hit that in a second? Because I would probably...
Go ahead and I'm ready to connect the dots, man.
Okay, so, like, we talked about the heart, and that being, what you're secure in, like, with your heart, and that kind of closely connects to love.
Yeah.
And that connects here. And when we go down to 28 through 31, we read this passage of really a ton of, like, stark things, talking about greed, evil, envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. It's like a complete contrast to 1 Corinthians 13:4, where we see this matter of love and how it's patient, how it's kind. And I think, especially nowadays, like with same-sex relationships, like the reason behind it or the justification behind it is that it's just love. And I think that it falls into like this deceitful nature of our heart, and what we follow in terms of love.
I think you're spot on there. Especially, you compare it to 1 Corinthians 13. If I can, I'm going to even bring it back to the book of Romans for a second. Romans 1. At some point in time, read Romans 1 and the verses that Cole just referenced there in 28 through 32. We'll just expand that.
Yeah.
Alongside Romans chapter 12. Verses 1 through, actually just the entire chapter. Just compare the two hearts present in Romans 1 versus Romans 12. The heart there in Romans chapter 1 is conformed to the image of man and what makes me feel good and what makes me better. Or at least feel better. Regardless of what damage it does to you, it makes me feel good. The heart there in Romans chapter 12 is the one that's transformed. It's conformed to the image of its creator. It's the one there that love is patient, love is kind, as Paul goes on to explain there in 1 Corinthians 13. So 100% I think Cole's on to something. And one of the, to Cole's point there in a second, a moment ago, one of the things that our greater society has done has not defined love correctly. Love has been defined society-wise as what makes me feel good. And you affirm what makes me feel good. But that's not a great example. That's not a great definition of really true love. And that's why I think 1 Corinthians 13 comes in really super helpful there. Because true love, as Paul describes it there in verse 13, is just incredible and also challenging. Like it's more than a verse that we need to be reading at weddings. Like it needs to be something that we think about daily. Any other thoughts all the way to verse 27? Yeah.
It just makes me think of, like the parable of the what were they, the husband, whatever, the vineyard and
Yeah.
the keepers of the vineyard. How the owner and the owner's son were rejected, yet they were enjoying the fruits and everything regarding what the owner and the son, it was theirs. It wasn't the tenders of the garden.
Yeah.
And so it kind of makes me think that also gives way to not being thankful just by pure placement. In other
Yeah.
words, you've rejected.
Yeah.
So it's like somebody came in and furnished a house for you and made all kinds of wonderful food that they thought you would
Yeah.
like, and then they came and rang on the door, and then they asked you, well, did you like these things they laid here? And you said they called someone and took them away. You're like,
Yeah.
that's just
Yeah.
insane, really.
Yeah.
But it's kind of goes to, then what would you do? You would just do whatever you wanted inside that house.
Yeah.
And then eventually the owner or the person that did that would come back and like, this is not what I had
Yeah.
intended.
And a lot of what you're saying goes back to the idea of being grateful to God for what He has given us in creation. I mean, Paul talks about that there in verse 21. So as you were describing that, my mind was just drawn back to verse 21. That in this attitude of idolatry, basically looks at God, who's given us creation, who's given us the breath that we breathe, and goes, it's almost like we're going, God, thank you, but I'm going to do my own thing. Adam and Eve in the garden. You've given us this beautiful garden. We don't have to really work. You have blessed us. We have everything going for us. But that's not good enough. I want that one tree. I want that one piece of fruit. That's what idolatry does. It looks at God with an ungrateful heart and says, I don't care. And to kind of build on the illustration you just used, which I think is phenomenal. Imagine for a second those of you who are adults and have mortgages or have rent. Someone said, I'm going to pay your rent for the rest of your life. I'm going to pay your mortgage off. How thankful are you? Seattle real estate's pretty expensive. I think most of us are really, really, really grateful for that. God has given us so much. And yet sometimes we are not grateful. We do not have the gratitude that we should. And so what here in the text, not only are they not grateful, they're denying God's authority to dictate what He does. And one of the core principles of the Scriptures, and we're going to see this unpacked more in a week, at least, that's my plan, is that the Creator has authority over the created. The Creator tells the created what to do. And so they've denied the authority of their Creator, and that led to the erosion of society. That led to all those sins that Cole alluded to a moment ago there in verse 29. That they're filled with all unrighteousness and evil and greed and wickedness. They are full of envy and murder and quarrels and deceit and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, arrogant, proud, boastful. Inventors of evil. Okay, kids. Disobedient to parents. That's for you, Jackson. Senseless, untrustworthy, unloving, and unmerciful. Although they know God's just sentence, that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but even applaud others who practice them. What jumps out to you from those verses? Yeah.
There's a couple times in the verses that we're dealing with here that, in a sense, they knew God.
Mm-hmm.
So it gets back to that heading, unbelief and its consequences. They recognize God, but they just don't want to accept. Their heart isn't right, and again, leads to all of the trials that we see in this text.
And what God has done here in the text is God's like, you're going to reject me? The consequences are yours. He hands them over. Maybe you've had to deal with that as parents, those of you who are older and a little further along than Allison and I are. Maybe you had a point like that where your child was making a boneheaded decision and you're like, you know what? You want to make that decision, you make that decision, but you're going to face the consequences. You're the one going to deal with it. For me there in verse 32 jumps out. That it's not only the fact that they're practicing these things, it's also those who approve of it or applaud them for practicing. So we're lumped in there if we're okay with some of these sins. And if you look at that list there in 29 and 30 and 31, those aren't just big sins that we would, there's some heart sins in there. There's some sins perhaps that maybe we're struggling with. And so this is not just written to the Greek saying, get the sexual sin out of your life. It's not written to the world around us for the same purpose. It's written to us as well. It's written to the Jew and Gentile Christians there in the text in Rome, saying, this is what's going to happen to you. That if you don't deal with these sins that are in your heart, you deserve to die. That's God's just sentence. It's a plea for the Jew and the Gentile. It's a plea for us today to repent of sin and pray for forgiveness from God. Any final thoughts there on Romans chapter 1? Really quickly, as we think about the Jewish worldview, and as we're transitioning there to Romans chapter 2, just a couple of things. So Romans chapter 1, Paul particularly aims his line of thought more toward Gentiles. And says basically, hey, Gentiles, you're sinners. Here in Romans chapter 2, it turns toward the Jew, and he's like, okay, Jews, you thought the Gentiles were bad, you have it coming too. That you're sinners. And we have a tendency to do some of the same things today. Like we look at the world around us and go, well, they're a bunch of heathens, they're a bunch of sinners. But we need to realize Paul's speaking to us in Romans 2. Especially those of us who perhaps maybe were raised or have been going to church for decades. A guy who I listen to and I deeply respect, and there in Romans chapter 2 and verse 13, translates it, and when I say translate it, he interprets it, he kind of puts his own spin on it. There in Romans chapter 2 and verse 13, his spin on it is this: for it's not just those who go to church 2 times a week who are justified, but those who do God's will who are justified. It's not just being able to say, I go to church, it's doing God's will. And that's where it hits close to home for those of us who are believers, who are Christians, that being a Christ follower is more than just saying, I'm a Christ follower. There requires some action on our part. And so here in Romans chapter 2, he's describing the Jewish worldview, the religious, if I can put it that way, the religious worldview. And he's basically turning to the Jews and saying, look, in Romans 2, You boast in your circumcision. You boast in your righteousness. But while you do that, when you teach another, in verse 21, do you teach yourself? You who preach, you must not steal. Do you steal? You who say you must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who detest idols, do you rob temples? You boast in the law. The Jews loved the Old Testament law. Do you dishonor God by breaking the law? And then he brings it home there in verse 24. For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Because the Jews weren't practicing what they preached, God was not glorified. And I think about us as Christians, and I'm broadening it to include everybody who claims some, I'm going to use it this way, flavor of Christianity. That every time a Christian is arrested for sexually molesting one of the members, every time a Christian preacher is doing that, caught doing that, every time there's some sort of misconduct by a Christian, God is blasphemed. It hurts our witness. So for those of us who are Christians, those of us who are believers, and we're in our workplaces, Paul's point to us here, and the application for us here, is that our conduct needs to honor God, and it needs to allow our co-workers and our family and our friends and the world that we come in contact to glorify God. They should see our conduct and glorify Him. They should not see our conduct and blaspheme God and go, if that's what God's all about, I want nothing to do with it. And that's what was happening with the Jewish people there in the text. They were so focused on their self-righteousness, they didn't realize they were also breaking the law. What do you think about the Jewish worldview? What problems, what struggles, what ideas, what things come to your mind there in the text? Yeah.
Well, they had the grew up in the church kind of mentality, to put it in a more modern sense.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, well, you have responsibility, each individual, for your dealing, your relationship with God and with man, and you can't, there's no shoe-in, there's no excuses for you.
Yeah. If Paul was writing a letter to the church in America today, I think it would read very similar to Romans, at least the first 3 chapters of Romans. That he would look at the people in the church who have come out of the secular world, and he would describe them and would read something very similar to Romans chapter 1. And then he would say in Romans chapter 2, okay, you people who have been raised in the church, going to church your entire life. And he'd give us what for? Paul has a way of making us, kicking us all, getting at all of us and making us all go, yep, yeah.
So, going back to chapter 1 and the way it ends there, giving hearty approval to those. I've got a reference to Luke chapter 11 where Jesus is dealing with the Jewish leaders. And it reads chapter 11 and beginning in I think, verse 43. 46, I'm sorry. Woe to you, lawyers, as well, for you weigh men down with burdens hard to bear, while you yourselves will not even touch the burdens with one of your fingers. Woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets, and it was you, your fathers, who killed them. So you are witness and approve the deeds of your fathers, because it was they who killed them, and you build the tombs. It's like, again, this unrecognizing or failing to recognize the truth of the matter. It's like these Jewish leaders were building tombs to the prophets, even though their fathers
Yeah.
killed them, we could be susceptible to that same thing where whether we put people up on a pedestal or we fail to recognize the truth, and gets back to, as you stated earlier, being truly thankful for what God has revealed to us and done for us in the sacrifice of Christ.
Luke 11, I think that parallel, if I'm remembering correctly, in Matthew's Gospel is Matthew 23. 21 or 23 for some reason. Those are coming to my mind. You read those chapters and Jesus' woes upon the Jewish leaders and the warnings and judgments pronounced upon the Jewish leaders. And it should be a wake-up call for all of us who claim to follow Christ, because there's an element of all of us. There's a struggle for all of us who are Christians to come perhaps a little self-righteous. And
That
when
was
we read
the Jewish
yeah,
view.
that was the Jewish view. Look how righteous we are. We are sons of Abraham because my grandfather was Abraham. I am saved and I am a right relationship with God. And there's a temptation for us even today to say, my dad's a preacher, my dad's an elder, my dad's a deacon. My family has been Christians for 6 generations. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was baptized by Alexander Campbell. I'll be filled with a little bit of self-righteousness. And lose sight of how immensely blessed and how much God has showered His grace upon all of us. Because as Paul goes on to say there in Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, a verse that we probably have heard before, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Jew and Greek, slave and free, American or somewhere else. We all have sinned. We all have fallen short. We either fall perhaps into the sins of Romans chapter 1. We fall into the self-righteousness of the Jews in Romans chapter 2. We all have sinned. And what Paul is going to do is, in the book of Romans, is provide the answer. And systematically work through and show how God, despite our sin, provided an answer in Jesus Christ. And He's going to call us in the last half of the book, the last 5 chapters, 4 or 5 chapters, to live according to that sacrifice. To live consistent with that, if I can say it this way, Christian world. Any final thoughts on Romans 1 through 3? Realizing trying to go through Romans 1 through 3 chapters of Romans in one class does not do Romans justice. And at some point in time, I imagine we will loop back around and maybe get a little more detailed into the book of Romans. It's a fun book to think about and to work through. Any other final thoughts or comments? Questions? Concerns? Okay. On that note, in my best Daryl impression. Yes?
Yes, I want to know how to keep from getting into this kind of a situation.
Into what type of you said into this situation? So clarify what is the. I think
Well, you're talking a lot about sex,
yeah.
and I'm by myself,
Yeah.
and I get worried.
Yeah.
So should I take my 357 to bed with me?
Okay. So I may be from the South. Is a 357 a gun?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
It's a magnet.
Okay. I did not grow up with guns. I have shot a gun once in my life, and that was on our 1-year anniversary when Allison was out of town. And there was a 4th of July party at somebody's house. And okay, Allison, you're going to shoot a gun. They put the gun in my hand and say, shoot it at the skeet. And I'm like, what is this? What's going on? I have no clue what's going on. So when it comes to your question, I'm going to deal with it big picture. I think we all need to have an honest assessment and an honest critique of our hearts. To look at our hearts and ask ourselves, what is on the throne of our hearts? And if there is something on the throne of our hearts that is not Creator God himself, then we need to repent and turn back to God. Otherwise, we will face the consequences of those actions, that idolatry. Whether that's played out in sexual sin, whether that's played out in greed, or other forms of sin that Paul talks about there in the text. Does that answer your question at all? I'm not going to get into the what should you do with the 357? Should you turn the safety off?
Well, I said that for a reason,
No, yeah.
because, I don't wanna get in that situation. I don't wanna get in any trouble. I try to be a good girl,
Yeah.
and, it is difficult, because, but, I sure don't want shoes empty.
Yeah.
That would be awful.
Yeah, and the fact that this is weighing on your mind, that you're so concerned about not going down the path and committing that sexual sin, I think speaks to your heart and your desire to obey God and follow God's design in your life and submit. But these texts, I mean, we always need to be self-evaluating in looking at our hearts and asking ourselves, what do I need to change? What corrections do I need to make in my life? And how can I better follow Jesus this week? Any other thoughts or comments or questions? Okay, in my best Daryl impression, I will now say, class dismissed.
At one point, it's going to be Austin.
Yeah,
So you could just do two sentences.
I just can't do the whole over there.
You don't have to do the dirty.
I just can't get my.
You can do a bell. You can give you a bell. You can just say, just,
What?
good night. Roll over and be in a group.
There we go.
I just don't have it loaded.